Jeremy Bentham was an 18th and 19th century English philosopher who, in his book An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789, formulated the moral theory utilitarianism. In short, Bentham argues that we ought to maximise utility, and by utility he means pleasure or happiness, or a more encompassing word might be well-being. Basically, for Bentham, pleasure is good and pain is bad. So morally good actions, or morally right actions, are actions that maximise pleasure while minimising pain. Thus, utilitarianism is often summarised by the principle of utility that says we ought to do the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, in the rest of this video, I'm going to first explain what we mean by act utilitarianism, and then I'm going to describe three main features of Bentham's utilitarianism. That is that it's consequentialist, it's maximising, and it's impartial. And then we're going to have a look at the Hedonic Calculus, which is our means of, or Bentham's means of measuring and comparing pleasures so we can figure out which one is going to be the one to maximise. Bentham is an act utilitarian. This means that in each situation we ought to perform the action that would directly produce the most pleasure. This is in contrast to rule utilitarianism, which says that the right action is the action that conforms with a general rule that, if followed, would tend to maximise pleasure. So Bentham's act utilitarianism is relativistic. It says that what is wrong in one situation could turn out to be the right thing in another situation if in that situation it maximised pleasure. So, for instance, if breaking a promise you've made to your best friend would maximise pleasure in that moment, then that is what you should do. Rule utilitarians say that that would be quite a pretty shitty thing to do. So they might say that actually maybe we should conform to a rule that says keep your promises, because societies that keep promises tend to maximise pleasure better than societies that routinely break promises they've made to their best friends. Bentham's utilitarianism is consequentialist. Consequentialism says that we ought to, consequentialism says that the rightness and wrongness of an action is determined by the consequences of that action. Obviously, for Bentham, the consequences that have more importance is how much pain and how much pleasure is being produced as a result of the action. Bentham's utilitarianism is maximising, because it says, as we have said earlier, we ought to maximise pleasure, maximise utility. And to reiterate, this means that the morally good or the morally right action is that action that maximises pleasure. All other actions that fall short of maximising pleasure, all of those are morally wrong, and we're morally wrong to do those things. Bentham's utilitarianism is impartial because it says that we ought to give equal moral weight to everyone, and we shouldn't give any extra moral consideration to one person over above anyone else. One way Bentham puts this is to say that everybody counts as one and no one counts as more than one. Therefore, you ought to give the same moral consideration to a family member, say, as a complete stranger. Putting all of this together, we get a clearer picture of what utilitarianism is asking us to do. And that is that we ought to promote the aggregate happiness or the aggregate pleasure. That is, we don't care about specifically whose pleasure is being increased, as long as the overall pleasure is being maximised. Now, you might be wondering how we are supposed to measure pleasures and compare them in order to figure out which action would be the right one and how we're supposed to do good actions. Well, Bentham created the Hedonic Calculus, or the philosophic calculus, as a method of comparing pleasures so that we can figure out which action would maximise pleasure. It's composed of 7 elements. They are intensity, duration, certainty, remoteness, fecundity, purity, and extent. So, for every action, let's start with intensity. You have to measure the intensity of the pleasure being produced. By intensity, we just mean how pleasurable the pleasure is, because some pleasures are more pleasurable than other pleasures, right? So that's intensity. Then we measure the duration of the pleasure, which is how long it goes on for. Longer pleasures we should rate higher than shorter pleasures. By certainty, we're concerned with how likely it is, or how certain it is, that the pleasure is going to arise as a consequence of that action. The more certain a pleasure, the higher we should rate it. By remoteness, sometimes you'll see this written as propinquity. So by remoteness, we're concerned about how immediate the pleasure is going to arise as a result of our action. So sometimes you perform an action for pleasure, but the pleasure won't be experienced until further down the road. So For this, closer pleasures ought to be rated higher than more remote pleasures. Fecundity. Something that is fecund is capable of producing more of itself. It's fruitful. So here we're measuring how much the pleasure produced by the action will lead to other pleasures being created as well. Purity. Pure pleasures, that is, pleasures that don't come with associated pains, they should be rated higher than impure pleasures, pleasures that do come with associated pain. And finally, extent. So here we're measuring how much the pleasure from an action extends to others. So actions that produce a lot of pleasure for a lot of other people should be rated higher than pleasures that only extend to a few. And so that's it for the video. Thank you very much for watching. There will be another video on their channel that will go over objections to Bentham's Utilitarianism, and there are loads of them. So if you're doing an essay or for an exam, that's a really good one to look at, because it's so easy to criticize that you can have a good critical discussion about it. And also on the channel we'll look at other forms of utilitarianism, such as John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism as well. So make sure you check those out. For now, thanks for watching. See you next time.